Year 3, so it's time to read a series of unfortunate events. We left off last week we read chapter 10, and Violet had just climbed the tower to go and get Sunny, and when she got to the top she was just going to let Sunny go when she realised that her hook had actually hooked onto another hook, which was the hook hand of one of Count Olaf's accomplices, which isn't great at all. So we don't know what's happened there because we had to start exactly where it stopped. So we are reading chapter 11, which is what I'm trying to find right now. I can't find it. I keep searching. I keep getting from 10 to 12. Where is chapter 11? Aha! Chapter 11. So she's in there. She's realised that it's hooked onto one of the hook hands. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-handed man said in a sickly, sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her into the tower room and, with a flick of his hook, sent her rescue device clanging down to the ground. Now Violet was as trapped as her sister. I'm so glad you're here, the hook-handed man said. I was just thinking how much I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat. What are you going to do with me? Violet asked. I said, have a seat. The hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into the chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. I am certain that over the course of your own life you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph taken a very long time ago of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that are very precious and dear to me. The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf, and they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper in which he had written his evil ideas in illegible scrawling, lying in messy piles on top of the copy of Neutral Law he had taken away from Klaus. There were a few chairs and a handful of candles which were giving off a flickering shadow. Littered all over the floor were empty wine bottles and dirty dishes, but most of all, the drawings and the paintings and carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceiling and scratched into the grimly wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled along the windowsill, and one big eye painted on the knob of the door handle that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. Sounds like Count Olaf is just as obsessed with eyes being all over the room as much as I am with sunflowers being all over our classroom. Sunflowers are much nicer than eyes, though, I think. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed a button and waited a moment. Boss? It's me, he said. Your blushing bride has climbed up here to try and rescue the biting brat. He paused as Count Olaf said something. I don't know, with some sort of rope. It was a grappling hook, Violet said, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. I made it myself. She says it was a grappling hook, the hook-handed man said in the walkie-talkie. I don't know, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Of course, I understand. She's yours. Yes, boss. He pressed a button to disconnect the line, and then turned to face Violet. Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride. I'm not his bride, Violet said bitterly. Very soon you will be, the hook-handed man said, wiggling his hook in the way most people would wag a finger. In the meantime, however, I have to go fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked into the room until the night falls. That way, Count Olaf can be sure you will stay out of mischief. With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him and listened to his footsteps fading down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister of fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about Count Olaf's wrath, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything will be all right. But of course, everything will not be all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things her and her siblings have experienced recently. Their parents had died suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had bought them ugly clothing. Then they moved to Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mrs. Poe had refused to help them. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with his knowledge that he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lambently deplorable, a phrase which here means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with the final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two. I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pyjamas. "What has happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are you up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down to the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught, and now we're all doomed. The hook-handed man said he'd keep us up here until tonight, and then it's the marvellous marriage." "Do you think you could invent something that would help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said. Why don't you go look through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that we could use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room and their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects which she could use to invent something. Klaus reached through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said, around noon, "I could make a Molotov cocktails with these bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract attention of a passerby." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge with the statement of I do and the signed document in their own hand. I read it here in neutral law." "But we're not polygamous," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say I don't instead of I do," Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped off the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation that they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked as shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved his hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind this room and we will keep constant contact throughout with walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other and then at Sunny, still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as all hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of this predicament. Violet was feeling the same way, until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second, and began to think. stairs and out the door, and the short walk down to the block of the theatre, Violet thought and thought and thought harder than she had ever in her entire life. And that's the end of chapter 11. So again, just like the other chapters, we're given a tiny, 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 tiny thing. Has she just thought of another way out of it? I know that her other thoughts and Klaus's other thoughts haven't really worked out, but at least she's trying. She's definitely using some emerald power here. She's definitely bouncing back and keeping on going, because she's just thought, I mean, it hasn't said that she's thought of another plan, but I'm guessing because of the way it said that she looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. She's clearly thought of something, but we don't know what. So we have got 2 more chapters of this story. Is it going to end well? Is it not? I think, because I know there's so many other books, I think they definitely managed to get out of this situation, but it's going to come at some kind of cost. They're going to get out of it, but maybe another problem happens, because we know it's called a series of unfortunate events. A series of unfortunate things are going to happen. So I do think they're going to get out of it, but it's going to cause something else to happen. But I don't know. Come back tomorrow and join me for the next chapter, chapter 12. See you then. Bye.